Okay, good morning everybody. Thank you for coming along to this launch conference on a report on the impacts of conflict in Iraq, specifically around conflict pollution caused in the recent conflict with Islamic State. My name is Doug Weir. I'm an NGO and coordinator for the Toxic Remnants of War Network, and we're a global network of NGOs advocating for a greater standard of protection before, during and after armed conflicts. We were pleased last night that the conflict pollution resolution tabled by Iraq has been accepted and agreed, and our thanks to the government of Iraq for the initiative. It's a vital issue, conflict pollution. We have a range of pollution themes being discussed at UNEA, and implementing any of those agreements will be impossible in situations of armed conflict or in post-conflict. So conflict pollution is an issue which cross-cuts many forms of pollution in relation to conflict. It's my very great pleasure to have on my right Dr. Jassim Al-Falahi, the Deputy Minister of Health and Environment in Iraq. Further to his right is Ambassador Zayed Nouri, Iraq's representative here in Nairobi. On the end, Peter Schwartzstein, a freelance journalist covering environmental issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. To my left, Ollie Brown, Senior Programme Officer with UNEP and coordinator of their Disaster and Conflicts Programme. And then on my far left, Wim Zwijnenberg from PAX, a Dutch peace organisation which works on conflict in the environment and a range of arms control and humanitarian issues. So we'll start off with the Deputy Minister, and because they have to leave in around 10 minutes, and they will give a few remarks about the situation Iraq has faced. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all, ladies and gentlemen. Really, it's a very good opportunity to explain something regarding the serious challenges, environmental challenges in my country. At the beginning, really with high appreciation to the document that has been done by the NGOs and by PAX and UNEP. This report was very important and expressed really what we had been faced in Iraq, especially in the liberating area from ISIS. You know, really we are facing a serious environmental challenges, and we are working very hard, especially with high cooperation with UNEP, in order to do what we call the environmental assessment for the serious challenges that we are faced. And you know very well that ISIS destroy many things. Not only they are not only affect the people, and they are responsible for much more than 4 million people who are obligated to be displaced from their home and land, but also affect the environment. And example for these serious bad effect of serious effect of ISIS, what happened in Al-Mashraq sulfur factory, and also in Al-Kayara oil wheel burning, and that results in a very disastrous situations, and it regards as one of the very serious or environmental crisis in 2016. This report was very important to highlight upon the serious challenges that we are faced. Really, we are here to explain that without the support of the international community, we cannot, with our national ability to reduce or to minimize the effect of these challenges. The environmental crisis of Iraq, not only what happened in the post-ISIS, but also we are facing another serious challenges associated with the minimizing or diminish the water resources, what's called the drought, and also the impact of climate change of my country. We are working hard in order to coordinate with the United Nations organization, and really we have a very good understanding and cooperation with UN Environment in order to do what we call the capacity building for our employees and our technicals in order to deal with these serious challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like just to refer to what the Deputy Minister have talked about. He talked about the situation in Iraq after the defeat of ISIS and the seriousness of the situation there. I would like just to mention that the Iraqi delegation tabled a draft resolution about mitigating the effect of pollution in areas affected by armed conflicts and terrorist operations and terrorism. Now, this resolution is a cross-cutting resolution, talks about pollution in air, land, and waters. As you very well know that ISIS, when they felt the defeat, they just start torching oil wells and sulfur stocks, causing great disaster and pollution to an area of about 20,000 kilometers of area, which forced civilians to migrate, and we are facing a serious problem of environmental migration. The amount of displaced people are exceeding 4 million now because of this issue. Now, we just, in this draft resolution, we wanted to raise awareness among member states to help and assist Iraq in the assessment of environmental impact in these areas, and help in the restoration, rehabilitation of the affected region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass over to Wim Zwijnenberg from PAX. So PAX has been undertaking monitoring and research work on the environmental damage and conflict in Iraq, and has a new report which you have copies of around the room and also online. So Wim, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Wim Zwijnenberg from PAX. Also, I want to like to express gratitude also for the Iraqi Minister and Iraqi Ambassador for attending our press conference. It's very helpful to also amplify the voice of Iraqi communities, and we're working in Iraq with our local partners organizations in UNEA and Kirkuk and to address these issues. And it's also, I know from the field, having talked with people there, it's being much appreciated that their opportunity, that their concerns are getting a voice also in the international fora such as UN Environment. So PAX has been monitoring the conflict in Iraq since 2014, and what we try to demonstrate with this report is to show what kind of work can be done already during conflict to identify key areas of concerns where pollution may occur and where pollution can create health risk for local communities, and we hope to collect this data, to have this data collected that can strengthen post-conflict assessments and rehabilitation work and minimize risk for civilians. And I will quickly run through some of the key findings of the report. Basically, what we aim to do is looking at like what kind of challenge for public health are there in conflict zones, and I used open source tools. So we're monitoring social media accounts from people working or living in the areas, or from armed groups, from the coalition. We will look using satellite imagery to look at sensitive sites. We use open source information on industrial sites and to see if there were fightings around industrial sites. There was reports from journalists on oil pollution taking place, and we've all used this data and collected this data to utilize that and to write about this to demonstrate what work can be done. It also should be a inspiration for international organizations and for states to see that we should not wait until after the conflict, but there's already done work be able to be done during the conflict that can also help prevention and advocacy to show to warring parties what the effects of their actions can be. So PAX is doing some more work. So here's some examples from our reports in Syria, and we looked at artisanal oil refineries and the wider issues. But this one is focusing on Iraq, and there were already some existing issues in Iraq from previous wars, from environmental change, from climate, and from environmental governments, which was in need of improvement, which UNEP, United Nations Environment, also supported from 2003 with assessments and also with building on legislation and implementation of environmental regulation. But they were already considering challenges, and so which the current conflict added to. So When ISIS, the so-called Islamic State or Daesh, was retreating, they used scorchers tactics to affect also the local population and to that also had an impact on natural resources in Iraq. So we've seen already the images from Gayara, where 19 oil wells were burning for over 8 months. But Gayara was not the only thing that was happening. That was the most visual one, but there are also small-scale pollution sources. So here's another image from Mishrak, also which got into the news, sulfur factory where 600,000 tons of sulfur dioxide burned. Over 1,000 people had to be hospitalized, and over a dozen people sadly died from exposure to these toxic fumes. And still, people are concerned over the long-term effects of that pollution. But it's not only in Gayara. So in the Hamreen Mountains, the various oil wells have been burning since 2015. And in early October, when the Iraqi army started the offensive to defeat ISIS in the Hamreen, in the Kirkuk area, retreating ISIS groups also set fire to more oil wells in the region. Here's another image from a journalist who took a picture there. It's the reminiscent of what's happening in Gayara. Also in 2014, in 2015, there were heavy fightings over the Baji oil refinery, the biggest oil refinery in Iraq, which was heavily damaged and taken out of operation. So it was also close to the Tigris River, and which also has been severely affected by the fighting. So that we probably find a localized pollution there as well. Of course, here's another example of the Gayara oil wells, which have been monitored by NASA. Early 2017, PACS, together with support from UN Environment and UN OCHA, and working with humanitarian organizations from Oxfam, we've visited the area and tried to identify or talk with people and to see what their impressions are. And together with UNDP, we did a survey on among local communities on their concerns over environmental health risk. And the survey, which interviewed local people, expressed, where in the survey local people expressed their concerns. So the survey was done in April 2017 when the fires were already out, and local communities expressed their concerns over the long-term impact because they didn't know how severe the damage was. They complained about medical problems, and the livestock was affected, the agricultural lands were affected, and they feared that now the fires are out, they will be forgotten. And this is also something why we want to address this here, to deal with these long-term problems. And we also want to stress that these communities who have been affected by pollution will be in need of support, both medical support. There will be monitoring, and there need to be monitoring of environmental pollution in these areas. And people have need to have a place where they can go to if they are concerned over the health effects. And there's something, another issue as well came up in the survey, that especially poor people have been affected because they cannot travel to hospitals in the region, so they have to stay in Gayara and surrounding villages. And people who have money are able to go to Mosul or other cities where currently the medical system is being repaired or being set up, but they were not able to. So there's also a socio-economic dimension to pollution and pollution effects. Another thing we noticed as well in Iraq was the rise of artisanal oil refining. So basically, after the professional oil refining was taken out, civilians started to refine their own crude oil, and also armed groups use that as well. And we witnessed over 20 clusters we identified using remote sensing, where 1,600 small oil refineries were built and run by local groups or by civilians. And we know from examples in Syria, so here's an image how it looks like on the ground from Syria, how polluting that can be, and often many children work in these hazardous working conditions. And in Syria alone, we expect there are over 50,000 of those refineries. And in Iraq, I mean, many hundreds of people have been working in these horrible conditions. So we've located those areas around south of Mosul, near Tel Afar, and also in the Hawija area as well, and using remote sensing, so satellites, and also on-the-ground reporting through our network of journalists and other contacts. Another issue we've come across is pollution from oil wells. So here's an example. We witnessed the oil spill in the Hamreen Mountains, which occurred in 2015, where an oil spill of 11 kilometers was affecting agricultural land and local communities. So you see here the river of oil was flowing through the landscape. Yes?
Sorry, we don't want to interrupt. It's very interesting. I've seen it. But we have to join another meeting with Mr. Solheim, so I would like to thank you.
Yes.
On behalf of my country. for the efforts that has been done by you and your group, and wish you all the best. Just rest assured that my government is willing to receive you and your group, your team, anytime you wish. Yes. And we are so grateful for what we have done and what we are going to do. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Well, thanks for joining.
I'm sure the Iraqi delegation would be more than happy to answer any questions if you'd like to follow up on this after the event.
So just to finish this one, so here's another example of a oil spill in 2014, which crude oil was leaking into the river, and they had to put it on fire to limit the impacts, because otherwise it was flowing down to Baghdad, and this was an oil spill 17 kilometers long. So we also looked at damage to urban areas. So Mosul was heavily damaged, generating millions of tons of rubble, often mixed with hazardous waste. The same goes for cities like Ramadi, Tikrit, Fallujah, and other small towns where intense fighting took place. So we have also an accumulation of all types of waste there. Here's an example of what the UN Habitat did in Iraq. They made an overview of environmental sensitive sites and industrial sites. This is one of industrial sites, and then UNEA provided the damage assessments, so you can use the different layers to assess which critical areas or which industrial areas are being hit and where pollution can occur. So this can be taken into post-conflict assessments or reconstruction programs if you have that data. Also, there were concerns over the IDP camps and waste generated and how to deal with waste from IDP camps, and that's also something that's now currently being discussed in the UN cluster system. And there's a lot of opportunity there to improve as well, looking at what can be done to limit the footprint of those camps, and how to improve dealing with waste and water collection around those areas. This is just like a short overview, because I also want to give time to other speakers to address the issues of pollution that occur, and it's just a small sample of what we did with regards to doing a survey on health effects, but we feel like this should be included, the community concerns should be included as well in post-conflict assessments, because we witnessed there could be those kind of issues. If they're not being addressed, they can cause grievances amongst local communities towards the central government or towards other groups if pollution is not being cleaned up, as we've witnessed as well in other conflicts and also in Iraq and in previous conflicts. So we put forward some recommendations, which you can all find in the report. I will not go to them in detail, what the Iraqi government can do. I will also, as we're discussing it here, what the international community can do on implementing the resolution and providing support to affected states and to improve humanitarian response to conflict pollution. Yeah, I will leave it to that. You find more information in the report, which is now online, because I see all the copies are gone. You can find it on pax4peace.nl. There's a PDF version there. And thank you very much for attending.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wim. I think work like this demonstrates how civil society organisations can support UN environment and governments in documenting the environmental consequences of armed conflict. So speaking of UN Environment, our next speaker is Ollie Brown, from the coordinator of their Disaster and Conflicts Programme. UN Environment have been undertaking post-conflict assessments since 1999, I think, and in around 40 countries. And they recently undertook an initial assessment of the environmental damage in Iraq caused by Islamic State, which was published in September. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Ollie.
Very good. Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Yeah, as sort of Doug said in the introduction, UN Environment plays a role to help countries assess and address the environmental impacts of conflicts, natural disasters, industrial accidents. It's one of our 7 priority areas that we work on. I coordinate that. I just wanted to make 3 very, very brief points. I mean, the first is, as you've seen from Wim's presentation, the environmental impacts of conflict create major challenges for the country rebuilding in future. So they help to exacerbate the humanitarian toll of the crisis, complicate rebuilding, and you know, increase the humanitarian toll of what is already a very devastating and very long-run crisis. The second point is that if you're going to deal with those problems, you need to know about them. And if you don't know about it, you can't manage it and you can't reduce it. So exercises like this, understanding what's going on and understanding in real time as it happens what some of the potential environmental health impacts of these conflicts are, is critical to actually addressing them and reducing them and making sure that the population doesn't suffer more than it is already from some of the collateral impacts on environmental health. And the third point is that, as Doug was saying, it's really important to have lots of different groups working together on this. It's the responsibility of governments to address. We work to support those governments, but the rise of new technologies, the rise of some of the satellite technologies, some of the social media technologies, to understand what's going on, and the role that civil society groups like VIMS, like PAX plays, like Doug plays, with the Conflict and Environment Observatory and the Toxic Remnants of War Network, is extremely important to help to come together with an overall picture of what some of the challenges are. And so we really welcome work like this, reports like this. This can really support our work and support the work of the Iraqi government in rebuilding in the areas that have been liberated from ISIL and Daesh. I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ollie. Briefly, our next speaker is Pete Schwartzstein. He's a freelance journalist, writes for National Geographic, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and probably many more platforms, I fancy. But he specialises in environmental issues in the Middle East and North Africa region and has recently been undertaking some research in Iraq.
Thanks, Doug. I'd just like to add a few brief remarks about sort of the wider implications of an environmental crisis as has befallen Iraq in recent years. Among the environmental issues that I've been covering over the last few years is a sort of a long report conducted in sort of bits and pieces, fits and starts, over the last 3 years on how a combination of environmental woes, including climate change, had driven a considerable number of rural Iraqis and Syrians sort of into ISIS's clutches. We talk about pollution as a sort of public health crisis, as a food, water crisis, but there are also very, very serious national security implications. I'll just sort of whip out a few quick anecdotes to illustrate the point. In the years running up to ISIS's big emergence on the scene in Iraq in 2014, large parts of northern and central Iraq had been suffering from a horrible series of droughts. And ISIS and its sort of jihadist forebears took tremendous advantage of this. They would pitch up at fertilizer markets and they would arrow in on the most shabbily dressed of farmers, seeing that they would perhaps be particularly amenable to their recruiting calls. They would, after a horrible drought, killed off large swathes of livestock, particularly around Kirkuk. They would turn up and basically survey these struggling herders who were trying to sell off the last of their cattle and sheep before they too succumbed to drought. And I mean, this is a few quick points to illustrate the just this sort of pattern. I conducted a lot of field work around Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown in northern Salahuddin Governorate, and found that there was quite a close correlation between villages that had sort of supplementary access to irrigation canals, i.e. were not wholly dependent on rainfall for irrigation, and kind of lower numbers of ISIS recruits. Among all these villages, there was a largely homogeneous sectarian balance, largely equal degrees of prosperity prior to the drought. And yet, if a village had access to an irrigation canal, it yielded something like 5 times fewer the number of fighters than villages that were kind of dependent on rain alone. And just a second quick illustration, I also did a lot of work in Tharthar sub-district, which is an area just to the west of Samarra, a little to the south of Tikrit. And here I found that farmers joined the jihadists in far greater numbers if their farms were kind of situated on the desert side of this agricultural sub-district. And that's because a combination of desertification and water woes had meant that they were extra susceptible to environmental damage. And many of these farmers who were further away from the river valley were just much poorer and as a consequence seemingly more amenable to to the recruiting calls of ISIS. So yeah, just to sort of illustrate the importance of PACS's work, we're not just talking about improving the public health of Iraq, we're not just talking about ensuring its water and food security. It also seems as if the sort of future security of Iraq rests in part on it getting to grips with its pollution-related damage and other environmental woes. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think this is a key point, but environmental security really means addressing the environmental dimensions of conflicts throughout the conflict cycle. So looking at the environmental drivers of conflict, like drought, environmental degradation, trying to address the behaviors during conflict which cause environmental damage, be they from state or non-state actors, and then looking at the environmental damage and environmental recovery post-conflict and trying to put in place those structures that help to prevent conflicts flaring up again. And increasingly we need to start understanding environmental conflict in these sort of principles. I'm going to open the floor to any questions, if anybody has any. Don't be shy. Excellent. Take on.
The environmental damage which has happened in the last few years. But what about the environmental damage which have happened since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where a number of military installations were targeted, which resulted in military waste, and then factories were targeted, oil refineries? Why we are not talking about that damages? Have we done any assessment which covers from that time the environmental damages till now? And who is going to pay for those damages? Are there these international, community willing to restore some of these environmental damages? Because it's not only Iraqi people. I know we are just talking about IS or this and that, But what about the other actors of the international communities who were also responsible for the environmental damage of Iraq? We should basically talk clearly about the, everything, not just a couple of years what happened in Iraq, what damages, but at least we should give the whole picture clearly so we understand how much damage, and have we done any comparison between that time the environmental damages has happened to the environmental damage happened in the last 2-3 years by IS or other religious groups or militia groups? So please, I would suggest that if we can have a overall picture, it will clarify the situation more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll maybe ask Wim to respond to that first, and then perhaps Ollie can respond about the long-standing programs that UNEP has had in Iraq. Wim?
Yeah, thank you, and it's indeed a very good question. So in our report, we do look at that in the beginning. So if you start to assessing the current damage, you also have to make a sort of baseline assessment on what it was before 2014. And of course, the 2003 war, but also the Iran-Iraq war, especially in the south, really affected the agricultural lands and the rivers, and also added to that the collapse of environmental governments after the 2003 war led to absence of strict regulation for industry, military waste, concerns over the use of depleted uranium weapons in the south by the US that had to be cleaned up. And so because this report focused specifically on the 2014 and after impact because of the enormous impact of the scorched earth policies by ISIS. But I do think, yeah, indeed, like I know, looking at the work that has been done since 2003, amongst others by UN Environment, who have been, I think Ollie can tell a bit more about that, but they've conducted several missions. They've supported the Iraqi government on regulation and implementation of environmental policies. But I think also within Iraq, they didn't really have a big priority for a long time to deal with environment. And also UNDP tried to assist as well the Iraqi government with implementing regulations on dealing with toxic waste. And there have been all kinds of work done, has been done to look at how to build capacity for different governance. And they were on the right track by setting up environmental monitoring systems in the south, air pollution filters, etc. But in the end, it's also about enforcing regulation, and we've also heard a lot of stories from Iraqi scientists who were concerned about it because there was continuous dumping of toxic waste from industries. Military waste was not addressed, and there has been work done to some extent and training done by UN Environment on capacity building in Iraq and dealing with pollution. But yeah, in the end, it's a national government's responsibility to also make work of this and reach out for support on that. But with regards to the UN Environment's work, I guess Ollie is in a better position to talk a bit about that. But I agree, one has to look at the complete picture, but for the sake of this report, we only focused on 2014, and we did some work on the past on other reports looking at depleted uranium and wider concerns in 2003, which you also can find on our website.
Sure. Just, I mean, very quickly, clearly, you know, the environmental impact of ISIS was not, didn't happen in a pristine environment. There's a whole history of very serious conflict-related and non-conflict-related pollution in Iraq that the events since 2014 have exacerbated, changed, and so on. I mean, from UN Environment's point of view, there's really two reasons why post-conflict assessments are done. One is highly political and is directed towards attributing blame and compensation and those kind of issues that can be extremely politically sensitive. And the second is really understanding what the impacts are and what can be done about them. So in terms of our work, we try and focus on the latter and try and understand what is the actual state of the environment in a particular place, because those are the things that determines the priorities for addressing that. Now, we've worked in Iraq for many years, ever since we've been created as an organization in 1972, but also on a whole variety of issues in the last 17 or so years around the marshlands and elsewhere, and supporting environmental governance. So our focus is really on what are the priority environmental issues and how can we support the government to address those issues. And so the work that we did that also, you know, has linked into the work of PAX is a sort of technical UN report saying here are some of the environmental issues in areas retaken from the Islamic State, again at the specific request of the Iraqi government. And so the focus is really saying, well, how can we address the overall issues in Mosul and the areas surrounding it, rather than trying to disaggregate what is attributable to ISIS or what is attributable to some other factor, because that, frankly, is the best way of actually understanding what the priorities are and what the next step should be for the government.
Thank you, Ollie. Peter, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I just have a quick additional remark, which is, I mean, this is in no way to downplay what happened in 2003 and in the years after that, and I will concede that my experience is often quite anecdotal. I'm not a scientist. I travel around as a journalist. But from what I've seen, the kind of focus on post-2014 related pollution is warranted in large part because, how to put this, ISIS, as Wim said, adopted scorched earth tactics as they retreated. And so the sheer volume of damage inflicted was in many ways significantly greater even than that of the 2003 invasion in the near aftermath. When I look around, when I travel around different parts of the country working on water, wildlife, agriculture-related issues, almost always the kind of perhaps most in-your-face manifestations of pollution are either a legacy of the last few years or of the Iran-Iraq war. And in part, that's perhaps because it was an 8-year slugfest involving hundreds of thousands of troops, while the invasion was a comparatively swift kind of military battle before it devolved into various sectarian conflicts. But just from a purely environmental perspective, the damage inflicted in recent years seems to be significantly greater than anything in previous iterations of the conflict.
Thank you, Peter. I think the Iraq situation really shows that there's a very long shadow cast on the environment from armed conflicts, which obviously last for years. I mean, Afghanistan is another good example where you have years of damage caused by the conflict and then almost total loss of environmental governance. And so you're having to rebuild from a very low position. And I think also it highlights the fact that there are no formal mechanisms in the international community for assistance. Things are done ad hoc. There's no court that you can go to easily to try and seek damages or reparations. And so, yeah, that's also something which perhaps needs to be addressed in future with changes to international law. Any more questions very quickly? I think we'll probably have to finish quite soon.
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering if it was possible in any way while you were doing your field work in Iraq to also make some sort of interventions to minimize the detrimental health and environmental impacts of war on the population, or was this time mostly dedicated to gathering data and assessing what the priorities are going to be for the future of rebuilding?
Yeah, thanks. A very important question. Because BEX as such is not a humanitarian response organization, but more of an advocacy organization. However, when the conflict when the impacts were starting to become more visual and more humanitarian organizations were present, we've engaged with, like, for example, with Oxfam, who did a great job, and UNICEF as well, on reporting on it and trying to get attention on what's happening in Gayara, because they were providing support, humanitarian support to local communities. And so we just discussed with them, and so they, as an outcome, they've included also looking at providing just like basic kits for protection of, like, for masks, a dust mask, and awareness raising in their among local communities on risks. So it's new. It's like this is sort of new work for a lot of humanitarian organizations because they have not encountered these specific pollution risk in their work, and this is also an ongoing discussion within the UN clusters, and we're very fortunate to be engaging with the Joint Environment Unit from UNOCHA, who also had a person in the field who was supporting, an environmental officer who was supporting the work for I think for 2 months, if I'm correct, 3 months. And who was like engaging also, and we supported them with connecting them with the various humanitarian organizations and providing information on where risks are, and provide an overview that also went back to in various UN reports to inform also the press and international community on what's happening on the ground. So I think that's a very important step, but that indeed much more can be done, and as mentioned as well, like, environment usually is considered a low priority because the effect's not always that visible, apart from when an oil well is on fire. But that's why we try to also come up with all these images and satellite images to demonstrate it's more chronic and to address these risks in the long-term recovery programs. So yeah, there's much work to be done to collect data through the humanitarian organizations or through local relevant authorities. So they can assist communities with fast cleanup if there are acute risks. So, for example, with Mishrak, the fire was put out quite quickly. But with other organizations, so with other issues like the pollution spills, that's still waiting to be dealt with by experts. So perhaps there could be a role for the industry. So, for example, in the south, there are a lot of international and national oil companies who have experience with dealing with environmental pollution from their own work and that kind of expertise can also be used in supporting the Iraqi government in the north on using the technology and expertise to clean up existing pollution from the conflict. So that's also an important role for them to play there. Perhaps anyone else has any suggestions for work? No.
Thanks, Wim. One more quick question.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question related to what you just introduced as the loss of environmental governance, because you've always been implied in the Iraqi context for several years now. I was wondering how from your different experiences, how did the capacities of the government, the Iraqi government, respond to these environmental degradations evolve? Did you notice tipping points and loss of their environmental governance? And the second question is, how does the resolution that you mentioned that was accepted yesterday night is providing a new setting, a new institutional setting to support the Iraqi government? Maybe it's a question more for the ambassador and the Iraqi deputy minister, but I think you have probably also answers to this. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Yeah, maybe just go across, starting from Wim, and see what people's take on that question is. If we do it fairly quickly, I think we're probably going to get chucked out fairly soon. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to put that one back to you, because Doug has been following the discussion from the inside out. Like, just perhaps we be able to give like how this resolution can improve these responses. And when it comes to the Iraqi government, like, we just started engaging with them. So in that sense, I have to look at Oli to know what I just can share what I've heard so far. And there's ongoing work now from UN Environment in cooperation with the Iraqi government to carry out a post-conflict assessment. But I'm not up to date on the details, so I'm afraid to go there. So perhaps you know more about that, Oli, what the current situation is. But I think they're still looking for funding to do a full comprehensive assessment, because that's difficult to get. And hopefully there will be a donor conference early next year. And we hope that there also will be funding will be made available, or capacity or expertise will be made available by donor countries to look at the environmental dimension of post-conflict reconstruction as well.
Yeah, I think just very generally, I think Iraq had quite a lot of internal technical capacity and expertise on environmental matters, sort of post-91, sort of well-educated population, scientists, and so we're technically in a reasonable position to be able to develop and strengthen environmental protections in the country. Obviously 2003 set things back, in particular the Coalition Provisional Authority and the insecurity in Iraq, which then had a huge impact on their ability to implement environmental programs, or even just their attention on environmental programs. And certainly there was capacity building work on particular key issues such as depleted uranium management and things. I think in recent years you've seen the shift in the ministry, which has merged health and environment, which is fairly unusual globally, but clearly makes a lot of sense in terms of the health consequences of environmental damage. As to the impact of the resolution, yeah, I think these things always need to see how they play out. I mean, it's not just a question for Iraq, it's a question for all states. And we would like to see the enthusiasm with which a number of states have negotiated the resolution, or elements of it, reflected in the implementation of the resolution between now and the next UNEA and beyond. And that will probably be a key test. I think that there seems to be a lot of focus on how UNEP will implement the resolution, but clearly there are obligations on states within the resolution as well. So we'll be scrutinising what happens on the text going forward. I think that's probably about it. Do you have any more very quick questions, or should we wrap up there? Brilliant, excellent. I'd just like to take a note to thank all our speakers, including our Iraqi colleagues who have left, to Wim Zwijnenberg from PAX, to Peter Schwartzstein, and also to Ollie Brown of UNEP. And thank you very much.